What we're gonna do right here is go back, way back into time.
What do Doritos, a snoring bear, a bra shop, and Walt Disney's Lost Picnic Park all have in common? They're all part of Disneyland's incredible 70-year history, and chances are you've never heard these stories before. Welcome, my friend, to another episode from the WDW Radio Archives. I am Lou Mangello, and this is episode number 831. And every week or so, I'm going to select an evergreen episode from the archives to share with you that maybe you haven't heard before, or one that you haven't heard in a long time, and in this week's case, is perfectly appropriate for Disneyland's 70th anniversary. Everything from interviews to top 10s, relevant reviews and guides, Wayback Machines, and more. This is a great way to visit or revisit some of our favorite episodes, including ones you've suggested that I share from the archives. And as we continue to celebrate Disneyland's 70th anniversary, this week I wanted to take you on a trip back in time and maybe deep into the heart of Walt's original park with one of my favorite guests and dearest friends, the late, great Jim Korkis. And in this episode from the archives, Jim and I go beyond the map to uncover some of the hidden secrets, surprising stories, and fascinating history of Disneyland that maybe you haven't heard before. From things like the invention of iconic snacks like Doritos, my personal favorite, and the story behind the arrival of the churro, to long-lost lands, vintage shops, and deeply personal details from Main Street, USA, as well as some little-known and very, very, I promise, strange ties to Tomorrowland's mosaics. Really, we're going to peel back the layers of the happiest place on Earth like never before. And yes, you really are going to hear about snoring bears, the Wizard of Bras, Walt abandoned Holidayland, and how churros changed theme park food forever. And it's all sort of wrapped up in Jim's signature blend of research, heart, and incredible storytelling. And so this isn't just a celebration of 70 years of Disneyland. It's a little bit of a heartfelt tribute to our friend Jim Korkis and his storytelling and knowledge. And he had this incredible dedication to keeping Disney history alive for generations to come. I feel very much the same way as Jim. And I think Jim's legacy of Disney history and curiosity and passion continues to inspire us. I know me, even to this day. So whether you are a lifelong Disneyland expert or are visiting in your imagination or planning to visit soon, sit back, relax, and let's uncover some of the stories and secrets that make Disneyland so incredibly magical. And of course, I want to hear from you. What does Disneyland mean to you? Whether it's a favorite memory, your first visit, a moment that you sort of felt Walt in the park, or how it inspired your love of Disney. I want to hear your story, so you can call the voicemail. I'll play it on the air at 407-900-9391, or share it over in the clubhouse at wdwradio.com/clubhouse. Don't forget to sign up for my free weekly email newsletter so you don't miss a thing over at wdwradio.com/subscribe. Connect and chat with me on social. I am at Lou Mangello on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And if you are a creator, entrepreneur, or solopreneur looking to take your business, brand, or idea to the next level, or if you're looking for a keynote speaker for your conference or event, I share lessons from Walt and the Disney parks on leadership and customer service, many other topics. You can learn more and reach out to me directly over at loumangello.com. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's episode from the archives on the WDW Radio Show.
Hello, I'm Jiminy Cricket, and I'm going along with you on one of the most exciting trips you've ever taken. A tour of Disneyland, USA. We're going to visit Main Street, Adventureland, Frontierland, Tomorrowland, and finally, Fantasyland, where I make my home, of course. Best of all, we'll meet Walt Disney himself, and he's going to point out the principal sights in his Magic Kingdom.
No matter how many times you go to the Disney parks, there's always something unexpected to find, a story to discover, history to learn, and of course, food to try. And this week, I want to take you not to Walt Disney World, but to Disneyland, partly due to the fact that I came back from a trip to Disneyland last week. I'm getting ready to revisit it again this summer for D23 Expo and something special we're planning the day after on Disneyland's birthday, July 17th. So, as I enjoy doing with Walt Disney World, I wanted to share some of my favorite hidden treasures and secrets and stories that you may or may not have known about the happiest place on Earth. But of course, I cannot do it alone, and I wanted to bring along someone who not only knows this park so very well, but himself is a master storyteller, a keeper of Disney history, and is full of secrets. Some I'm probably sure I don't ever want to know, but he is a friend, an author, a storyteller extraordinaire. He is Mr. Jim Korkis. Welcome back, buddy.
Well, thank you so much, Lou, as always. And I certainly am full of something. And secrets is the nice way of putting it, I guess. And Disneyland, what a wonderful, topic, because unlike Walt Disney World, I think people have a different emotional connection to Disneyland. And in fact, most of the Disney fans that I run into consider themselves Disneyland experts, Disneyland know-it-alls. And I think it's because many of them, like myself, grew up at Disneyland. I lived out in Glendale, California, so thanks to my dad's Magic Kingdom Club card, we were able to go a couple of times a year. So I've experienced Disneyland as a kid, as a teenager, which is an entirely different perspective, and also as an adult. And, when I moved out to Florida, I thought, well, the Magic Kingdom is just sort of a little larger version of Disneyland, and it's not. It's like a Twilight Zone experience. In fact, the first couple of months I was out here, I was the Disneyland expert, so I was trying to give people advice by saying, just go past the Pinocchio ride, and they'd look at me as if I had three heads, because there's no Pinocchio ride at the Magic Kingdom. And I think Imagineer Tony Baxter summed it up best. I always go back to his description. He describes Disneyland as an intimate experience, but Magic Kingdom is a spectacular experience.
I agree. I think that there's something quaint and charming and still very special about Disneyland. I still remember the first time I went there as an adult. I was by myself, and you said that there's an emotional I think we have an emotional connection to Disneyland, even if we didn't grow up there. Because when I stepped foot onto Main Street USA and I saw Walt's Lamp and I saw Sleeping Beauty Castle, it was a very emotional experience, and it still is. And I don't just mean when I go and visit the Cozy Cone Motel and pick up my chili con carne, but I think that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about these. And look, when I put Disneyland secrets that you never knew, I'm using air quotes, because look, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of things that we could talk about in terms of Disneyland's secrets and stories and hidden treasures and gems. And we didn't really talk about this ahead of time, but I said, let's just try and do, like, I don't want to call it a top 10 list, but because there's so many, let's try and rein ourselves in and do 10 Disneyland secrets or stories that you probably never knew or didn't know, because I think it'll be a good opportunity for us to not only go back and forth, hopefully introduce people to some of these things and stories, or give people things to look for when they go, but a chance for us to talk about Disneyland as a whole as well.
Well, because I think experiencing Disney theme parks these days is quite different than from when we were growing up. I think today a Disney theme park experience is more of a reservation vacation, with the fast passes and the reservations at the restaurants and all of that. I see an awful lot of people rushing, to those reservations rather than taking the time to just look around and enjoy. And yes, when we come to secrets, I think it's important for the listeners to know that, how many secrets really are there, but sometimes something that is common knowledge to you might be a secret to someone else. So, for instance, and also there's significant differences between Disneyland and Walt Disney World in terms of the attractions. For instance, the queue line for Big Thunder Mountain Railroad out in Disneyland, they actually have a vein of gold, and that's not gold paint, that's actually gold ore that came from Rosamond, California. And the reason I emphasize where it came from is that is the same area where they filmed scenes for Apple Dumpling Gang. You know, just a few, within a few years of the attraction opening there. And of course, there's an old-fashioned steam engine in the queue line out there at Disneyland, and that came from the Disney film Hot Lead and Cold Feet. Now, for me, that's common knowledge. I've known that for years.
But the fact
you know, and yet sometimes I'll tell people, and they'll go, "What? What?" And for them, that's a secret. So, as
Jim,
you're
some people are actually Googling.
To Lou and I today, if something is familiar to you, realize that it may not be familiar to everybody, and also take it as a reminder that the next time you're in the park, go take a close look at some of these things. So Lou, why don't you start us off with one of those secrets that you like?
Well, first of all, there's a couple of things. I love the fact that you snuck in a secret without, because that's a typical Lou move for a top 10 list. That's how I make my top 10s like top 20s. I also love the fact that people are probably stopping the show, or while they're listening, they're Googling Hot Lead and Cold Feet because they probably never heard of it or saw it, although it starred Jim Dale and Don Knotts. And at the time, there's a lot of like Disney connections there. Buddy Baker, and it was a Ron Miller production. Like, I love that movie as a kid.
You know, but you know, the sad thing is, you and I, we grew up watching Don Knotts films.
Yeah.
We've got an entire generation now who has no clue who Don Knotts is. And actually, there's a Don Knotts tribute just across the street over at Disney California Adventure in the Little Mermaid attraction. Don Knotts was in that film, The Incredible Mr. Limpet, where he gets transformed into a fish, and the animation done by Bill Teitler, who did Stromboli and Pinocchio and Little Baby Dumbo getting a bath and all of that. And so Disney animators loved the animation, and so in the actual film of Little Mermaid, at the end of the Under the Sea number, if you look into the upper right-hand corner, you'll see Mr. Limpet. You'll see the blue fish with the Don Knotts glasses and the lips and all of that. And if you go ride the attraction, while you're going through that scene where Flounder is with the Carmen Miranda fish dancers and all of that, that's over to your left, and there's so much happening that you don't want to look over to your right. If you look over to your right, by a clamshell and not lit, is a figure of Mr. Limpet, looking very much like Don Knotts. But again, it's not Disney intellectual property, so it's like, well, is that really Mr. Limpet?
Right.
All I can tell you is they didn't put it into the one out here at Walt Disney World. So, so as we're explaining these secrets, we may have to explain some of the backgrounds on some of these. So let me share another secret here about the movable snore. You know, when you take Splash Mountain out there, there's a cave for Brer Bear, and he has his mailbox and the fishing pole, and you can hear Brer Bear snoring. And, you know, that's a nice gag, and, just a little nice additional detail. But the interesting thing is that snore is decades old. Pinto Colvig, who did the voice of Goofy, also did the voice for Grumpy and for Sleepy in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And there was one scene that was cut from Snow White where they're building a bed for Snow White. And of course, you would think that the expert directing all of this would be Sleepy, but Sleepy is sleeping. and he's just snoring away. And so Pinto Colvig, did the snore, but that entire scene was cut. Okay, so that snore sound, Disney doesn't throw away anything. That's in their sound library. When they come at Disneyland to make Mine Train through Nature's Wonderland, you go through the Rainbow Caverns, and there's that little town there of Rainbow Ridge. Well, there's a hotel, and in the second floor room, they have a snore coming out, and that was Pinto Colvig's snore from the sound library. Now, when they're building Bear Country, to incorporate Country Bear Jamboree out there, as you go past the Haunted Mansion, there's this sort of mountain that you have to curve around to get into, where the restaurant is and the attraction and all that. Mm-hmm. And there's a little cave up the mountain, and a snore is coming out of that, and there's a sign that it's Rufus. Rufus is one of the bears from Country Bear Jamboree, and the gag is supposedly that he's sleeping, so he's going to be late to the show or miss the show or whatever. Well, then the land changes into Critter Country. So instead of having the cave down below there, they move it up towards one of the first dips, and so they have Rufus's cave. But then Country Bear Jamboree disappears. We've now got Winnie the Pooh there, and Imagineers figure, hey, people don't know who Rufus is anymore, at least not out in Disneyland, so it makes more sense to make it Brer Bear because, he's prominent in the attraction. So now the snore is Brer Bear's snore. And that's one of my secrets of Disneyland. Woo!
But I love it. I love it for two reasons. Because it's one of those things that you're never going to find on a park map. You probably wouldn't notice it unless you were specifically looking for it. And it is one of those things that people can go and seek out and find the next time they go to Disneyland. The other reason why I love that was because I was fearful of this list. Because we said we were going to do 5 each. I came up with 6, and I'm like, I know that Jim is going to steal or use all 6 of mine first. So the fact that I at least to get one out before you give it feels like a win for me. And as I was looking at my list, I tried to go with what I thought were the biggest secrets, or maybe one somebody wouldn't know, or do I do it chronologically or some kind of... I'm going to stick to my wheelhouse, Jim Korkis, and my secret has to, of course, be about food at Disneyland. This body doesn't happen naturally. I work very, very hard at that, and I did a great deal of culinary research when I was out in Disneyland. I look forward to going back. And I said before, sort of one of my favorite places is the Cozy Cone and the Chili Con Carne. I'm going to try and bring this full circle because one of my all-time favorite foods anywhere on planet Earth was actually invented in Disneyland, in a dumpster. Let me explain.
I think I may know this secret.
Of course I know these secrets.
But please, tell us. See, I wouldn't associate it with the Cozy Cone. I would associate it with Frontierland. But let's hear this secret.
And the reason why I'm going back, and you'll see where I'm going with this, is, and again, I know you know this story, but not long after Disneyland opened in 1955, a few months later, the founder of one of my favorite companies, Frito-Lay, right, and there's Fritos in the Chili Con Carne, talked to Walt Disney and he agreed to let him open the Casa de Fritos in Frontierland, as you said, where they served typical Tex-Mex enchiladas and tamales, Frito pie. Oh, how I wish I could have tried one of those. And the tacup, right? It was a sort of a taco-type salad. And correct me if I'm wrong, originally this was on New Orleans Street, and then eventually moved over to Frontierland by where Rancho de Zocalo.
It used to be where the horse corral was, and after they moved out, Don DeFore's Silver Banjo moved into their original location there. But where there used to be the blacksmith shop, where the blacksmith was who was it? Willard Bounds, who was his wife's father, who used to be a blacksmith and a sheriff on Indian territory. So Casa de Fritos over there.
Right. So
and
they made all
these
these Tex-Mex foods, but they actually didn't make their own tortillas or taco shells. And because Frito-Lay didn't themselves either. They actually bought it from a nearby Anaheim food distributor called Alex Food, which was created by Alex Morales, who was originally a ditch digger, and he turned his love of making his wife's tamales into an actual business. And at one point, one of the Alex Foods salesmen saw a bunch of tortillas that were thrown away in the trash, and he actually suggested to the Frito-Lay people making tortilla chips out of them instead of just letting them go to waste. And long story longer, they did that. The customers loved them, and then together, I guess Frito-Lay and Alex Foods worked together to mass produce these oh so crunchy and delicious and orange cheesy all over your fingers and jeans flavored Doritos, which means little golden things. And from what I understand, like when they hit the market back in '66, I believe, it was something brand new. It was a huge hit.
Nothing like it at all.
And Jim, there still is nothing like a good bag of Doritos. And so that is my secret, is that one of my favorite, and hopefully one of your favorite foods, was actually invented in a Disneyland, for lack of a better word, it was invented in the Disneyland dumpster. Wow.
You know, and that's a true story. I know that for a fact, and that's one of the things that we all have to be careful about, because everybody thinks they know everything about Disneyland. You know, there's so many books, there's websites, there's magazine articles, things like that, and sometimes people just believe stories are true simply because they're repeated. You know, or they've seen it somewhere else in print, and if it's in print, it must be true. That's not always the case. But yes, this Doritos story is absolutely true, and I don't think Disneyland really gets the proper recognition for that. But again, you know, you're right. When you go to Disneyland, you just have some of the experiences are just the food, you know, and it's food that you can't get anywhere else. You know, I love getting the Monte Cristo sandwich at the Blue Bayou, or going up and around the corner over there by the train station, get the mint julep, you know, and you can't get that out here at Walt Disney World.
There's nothing like a corn dog from the Little Red Wagon on the end of Main Street, USA.
Well, and you know, the other thing that I associate with Disneyland, even though it is out here at Walt Disney World, is churros. Mm-hmm. You know, and again, you know, I just had to laugh at that Simpsons episode where Homer is escaping Epcot, you know, and climbs over the wall and then asks for a churro, and the vendor says, yeah, $14. Right. Which one of the reasons that's so funny is that's not out of line with the fact that that little piece of fried dough pastry and sugar and cinnamon costs like what, $3.50, $4 now.
But Homer, like us, gladly pays for it and enjoys his little churro. So,
well, and it was actually introduced here's a secret: introduced at Disneyland in 1985, and the reason for that is a food and beverage guy there. In Fantasyland, Jim Lohman, who I believe is still working at Disneyland to this day. He's coming close to retirement, but he's there. But in '85, they were going to open up this dance location called Videopolis. Mm-hmm. And I'm really dating myself of how old I am. I was around when Videopolis opened. But again, you've got all these young people coming in here. You want something to really define this area as new and different and all of that. And so Jim went out to the Long Beach Grand Prix event, and he saw his first ever churro booth. And he snooped around, and he saw that, hey, look, you know, all it takes is this is very simple to do, and there's just a small warming oven. And, following along in that Disney tradition of trash cans and Disneyland food, he snooped around in the trash cans and he found an empty box from J&J Snack Foods. And because they would pre-prepare this stuff, and so these vendors would just buy it and then, stick it in the warming oven. And so the next Monday, he phoned the company and said, would you like to work with Disneyland? Oh, yes, gosh, we'd love to work with Disneyland. But Lohman wanted something different. You don't just repeat what's out there. You've got to plus it. And so the original churros were only about 6 inches long, so he asked them to produce churros that were 12 inches long. And the other reason he did that was because you could charge more for it. That's the Disneyland way. So, again, his bosses didn't think this was, I don't know if this is going to work or whatever. And so he says, okay, well, we'll just do a 2-week test run. And this seems to be a Hispanic type food. So we'll have a little cart and we'll have it in Frontierland. We'll put it out by the entrance to the Mark Twain there, and we'll see what the reaction is from the people. So that first day, wheeling the cart down to that location, suddenly there were 30 people following. and I can understand that because I was at a comic convention years ago, and I smelt this wonderful, wonderful smell, and it took me to the back of the room, and what it was a vendor who was doing those cinnamon-coated pecans and cashews and all of that. And by golly, that smelled, and those are good stuff. I love that stuff. So anyway, in those 2 weeks, this was just a huge, huge hit. And so when Videopolis opened, they had 2 carts out there, and that still couldn't take care of the demand. And so now there are a lot of churro carts, just like rabbits. They multiplied all throughout the park there. And originally they were using propane, but they were going, each cart was going through a dozen tanks of propane a day. So they had to reformat it so that it, and again, propane, is highly flammable, explosive, whatever. So they had to change it to electricity. But by golly, that's why there are churros in Disneyland today. Now, we don't have as much of them out here at Walt Disney World, but boy, at Disneyland, that's one of those treats that you get that remind you of Disneyland.
Yeah, and even if you go to downtown Disney, there is a churro cart that has like 7 different flavors of churros. There's like dessert flavor, like there's a strawberry one and an Oreo one and a bunch of different. I need to go on another research trip. Obviously, I'm starving. I'm starving, by the way. So you need your next secret cannot be food related because I'm famished.
Okay, so we won't deal with Dole Whips or turkey legs or those type of things. And do they have? They must have chocolate dipping sauce for churros too, as well, right?
Yeah.
Because what is a world without chocolate? I am a unrepentant chocoholic there. Okay, so it's back in your court, Mr. Mangello. Do you have another secret to share with us?
I do, and I'm going to completely violate the rule that I just laid out for you, saying that it's not going to be food related. Because I thought this one was really interesting, especially in the past year or so when something was announced and changed at Walt Disney World. The internet, as it sometimes is wont to do, lost their collective minds and sort of talked about how Walt wouldn't have wanted it this way, and it's never been this way before, and I can't believe that we're doing it. And I'm speaking about the introduction and the sale of alcohol at the Be Our Guest restaurant during dinner time inside the restaurant in Magic Kingdom. And again, people said this just goes against what, Walt Disney World and Disneyland was always about. And to that I say nay. because you may or may not know.
You say nay, nay, I say?
Because I tell you, Jim Korkis, and I know you know this, you could at one time buy alcohol in Disneyland, and I don't mean at Club 33.
That's right, and you probably don't mean at there was before Club 33. There was a little behind the Red Wagon Inn. There was a little place called the Hideaway or the Hideout, which was a private area where Walt would take guests and VIPs and all that, and there was alcohol there as well. So I know you're not referring to that. What could you possibly be referring to in terms of alcohol at Disneyland? Disneyland is dry, dry, dry.
Well, so I want to take you back before Disneyland opens to around 1953, where there's this concept for a land known as Holidayland, which would have been a turn-of-the-century town park. It would have had places for picnics and horseshoes and a baseball diamond and maybe an open field where they can have performers or a circus or whatever.
Yeah, it was for convention groups and it was for companies who would want to go out and take a company picnic or whatever. And it was called Holidayland because every day is a holiday at Holidayland.
Exactly. And it was this idea. Remember, Walt was a nostalgic. He was a romantic. He loved this idea of, rural America in bygone days with the open fields and the gardens and families just playing together. So the idea was it could be a sort of picnic area where guests could celebrate kids' birthdays or other holidays, or they could use it for convention groups. They had a lot of catering spaces. And they would also be able to decorate it for the holidays. And so in 1957, Disneyland opens a 9-acre version of what is called Holidayland. And there are a lot of, if you had to almost associate Holidayland with a land in Disneyland, it would almost sort of be related to Disneyland. You'd sort of see slides that looked like Conestoga wagons, and there was, a wooden drawbridge, or all these things that sort of made you feel a little bit like it. But it was this large, open, 9-acre grassy picnic area. And so if you're trying to figure out where this is, it's near where New Orleans Square currently is.
Basically, the baseball fields are where the show building of Pirates is now. And the show building for Haunted Mansion is where they had the big red-white circus tent from the Mickey Mouse Club Circus that they brought out there so that they could then put in a stage there and picnic benches and all that, so you'd have a covered area for that to happen. So, yes, it's just right on the other side of the berm, right on the other side of the railroad tracks, and at one time there was an entrance into Frontierland around that area where the baseball fields were. And safety is most important at Disneyland, so you had to walk across the train tracks to get into Frontierland. So make sure you look both ways before you do that.
Because Holidayland, when it opened, so this is like June 16th, I think, 1957, you didn't enter from Disneyland. It had its own admission gate. And to give you a sense of how big it was, it could fit 7,000 guests in there at once. And it had all those things. It had the playgrounds and the baseball fields and the volleyball fields. That, like you said, that giant circus tent was in there as well. And, of course, there was food and concessions in there, including beer, which was not sold, which was, absolutely prohibited in Disneyland, save for Club 33, and it only lasted probably a little more than around 4 years or so. And it's
and again, beer was allowed there because Walt. I talked with Milt Albright, who was in charge of that area, and he said Walt felt that it was not in Disneyland; it was outside of Disneyland, and Walt also felt that a good picnic you need to have a beer. And so not only was there beer, Mr. Mongello, but here's another secret. It was supplied by the Red Wagon Inn from inside Disneyland, and once you bought it, it was unlimited beer.
What could possibly go wrong?
Well, apparently people got drunk, and instead of going to that one entrance where they had to pay admission and buy a ticket book and whatever to get in, they found other ways of simply walking across the railroad track or stumbling across the railroad track. And after they had a lot of beer in them, you could see why Walt did not want beer in the park.
Right.
Is that people were rowdy, they were howling, and it just made it very uncomfortable for a family experience.
But that was not the reason why it closed. I mean, it was. Again, think about this. It's this wide open...
Well, there were a lot of reasons.
Right.
The year before it closed, the Santa Ana winds came and literally ripped the tent to shreds. And also the fact that during the week, it was pretty dead.
Right.
If you were going to have a convention or a group, usually you had it, on the weekends or during the holiday.
Right. Plus, I mean, there was no shade. There was there was no lighting for nighttime. There was no restrooms. And look, it didn't feel like Disneyland.
What a terrible way to tease a kid. We're going to Anaheim, and we're going to go right where Disneyland is, but it's on the other side, and you can't go into Disneyland. So you can hear the Mark Twain, but you can't go there and see it. And you can hear all these wonderful things, but you can play baseball. You can do a sack race. You can do a pie eating contest. Ooh, it'll be so exciting.
And it's interesting though, Jim. When it closed in '61, they didn't use that space right away. It sat there empty for a couple years until they started to build New Orleans Square and Pirates and Haunted Mansion.
Well, and one of the secrets you've probably never seen is you were saying, there were no bathrooms there. Actually, they did have a men's and female bathroom, but it was, my gosh, you got 7,000 people, and you've got one restroom for the men, one, and they weren't even permanent restrooms. They're like those little porta potties, that you see, and so. I was told that you could literally see Walt's face drop, that the longest line was for the women's restroom, and so Walt had to bring in what are called honey wagons, which are ones that you rent on movie sets, because, when movies go out filming and all that, they have the trailers for the stars, but for the extras and all of that, you've still got to have, restroom facilities and all of that. So bought that. And then here's the sad, ironic thing is the year before the park closed, Walt finally anteed up the cash to build permanent restrooms. So there were permanent restrooms on the other side of the Frontierland Railroad track that nobody could get to. But they were still workable, and they were often used by the maintenance staff. But yes, right you are. Walt had alcohol within breathing distance of Disneyland.
And so tell me if this is true or if this is urban legend, that no good idea obviously ever dies at Disney. And back in the early 80s, not long after Epcot opened, they Imagineers sort of resurrected this idea of having this open air space where people could get together and celebrate, not sort of a catering space, but because there was still so much land that was sitting empty, even with the mansion and the Pirates building there, they had these old picnic grounds. And with Epcot and specifically World Showcase being built in Florida, they had this idea to not necessarily create the same type of picnic village, but more of an international village similar to World Showcase and Epcot Center. So now in Disneyland, they would have this open air area where a number of different countries and cultures could have this open air celebration going on all year long. There would be like an Oktoberfest area and an English medieval type show, and there would be something from Norway, and it was going to be called World Holidayland.
Yes. And again, just like everything at Disney, there were those ideas that were tossed out. But here's a secret, and maybe one of your listeners is old enough to remember this, because I remember this as a kid. Is Walt didn't want people to feel that they were forced to buy, food in Disneyland. Well, you're in Disneyland, you want to eat, you're going to have to pay our prices. As you went towards Disneyland, towards the ticket booths, if you went over towards the left, there was a fenced area, and it's the wire fence, and it's covered by this landscaping. But if you know it's there, you see that there's a little pathway, and you go in, and there's this concrete area, and it's fairly large, and it's got picnic tables. And Walt had it there so that if you brought food in your car or whatever, you could leave Disneyland, get your hand stamped. I always remembered getting my hand stamped. And you'd go to the car to get your food, and you could go and eat in that picnic area and, then dispose of the trash, and then you could go back into Disneyland. And I'll bet there are not a lot of people who know that, or a lot of people who remember that. And I don't know how long it lasted, but I know it was there in the 70s and maybe even into the early 80s there. But let's share another Disney secret. Let's share Nazis in Disneyland.
It
that
sounds
like a B movie, doesn't it?
It sounds like a Mel Brooks movie.
Everything sounds like a Mel Brooks movie.
Springtime for Hitler, Part 2.
Yes. What... Yeah, no, I just remember, some of the coming attraction gags at the end of History of the World Part 1. And I was like, oh, I would love to see some of those, the ones they was doing. All right. Nazis in Disneyland. Okay. I think a lot of us understand that Nazis are the bad guys, right? And the SS are the worst. And even today, when you try to come up with a villain, you go to the Nazis. And in fact, after World War II, it was it was the law that Nazis could not emigrate to the United States. If you had been a Nazi, especially in the SS, you are not allowed into the United States. You're a bad person, and we won. So there. But there were ways of slipping through that, especially if the United States felt, well, we needed this expertise. And, of course, that became known as Operation Paperclip, because when an application came in, paperclipped to that application from the United States military or the White House or whatever, it's like, we need this person. So, Wernher von Braun, who, was not just a Nazi, he was a high-ranking member of the SS, and it was obvious it's his V-2 rockets that are, being shot into England and whatever. Thanks to Operation Paperclip, he was brought into the United States because with his background in rocketry, America didn't have a rocketry program, and so the Russians were grabbing some of these Nazi scientists, so America needed to grab some. And so, it was like, well, he really wasn't in the SS, he really wasn't wait, there's these photos. He's in this uniform. He really was. And, of course, von Braun worked with, became the first director of NASA, but in the 50s worked with Disney on the Tomorrowland shows. And one of the people he worked with closely was John Hench, and the two of them came up with that TWA Moonliner, which was the big icon in Tomorrowland. And it was basically von Braun's V-2 rocket, but with fins that Hench added. But von Braun wasn't the only one who had a Nazi who had an impact in Disneyland. And I know I'm going to mess up this guy's name, but Hans Joachim Scharf. And he's a mosaic artist, and most of them know him as doing the mosaic in the breezeway of Cinderella's castle, and also with his daughter-in-law Monica doing the mosaic that's at the entrance to the land. You know, he's world-renowned and excellent. You know, Dorothea Redmond designed the murals for Cinderella's murals, but it was Hans there who did, you know, that hard work of, you know, snipping the tiles, putting them together, you know, putting the gold between the tiles. So he did all the grunt work, all the hard work for that. Well, he also did work for Disneyland, for New Orleans Square. You know, when New Orleans Square opened in 1966 there, you know, he did the tabletops in the Creole Cafe, the mosaic thresholds of the French Market. He worked on some of the design work for the specialty shops. You know, beautiful, beautiful work. However, this guy was a Nazi. He was a high-ranking SS officer. In fact, he was known in Nazi Germany as the master interrogator. In fact, there's an entire book that has been written about his career just as an interrogator. And he was so effective because he didn't use torture. He was just tricky, you know. If you were being interrogated by him, he'd go, well, you know, we know you have some men who are going to be, you know, hitting Dunkirk and all, and it's like, well, how do you know that? Well, I didn't know that until you just told me right now, type thing. So he wasn't one of those, we have ways of making you talk. He was a great manipulator. In fact, he was so great that, yes, he was part of Operation Paperclip and brought over to America so he could teach his techniques, his interrogation techniques, to the U.S. military. And so after the war, that's what he was doing for a couple of years. And then in 1950 is when he concentrated on artwork and mosaic, something that he had studied earlier in his youth, you know, before World War II. And so when we look at certain things in Disneyland, those are legacies of Nazi SS officers from World War II. And again, I think we just go, oh, that's nice, and we move on. But that's a secret of Disneyland. Woo!
Well, and I think it's interesting, too, when you mentioned the Castle Breezeway in Walt Disney World. You know, we talk about how the teams of artists and designers and Imagineers do all this amazing work, and save for tributes that either exist on Haunted Mansion tombstones or on Main Street USA windows, the artists never get a chance to sign or get recognized for their work.
No.
The Breezeway is one, I think, notable exception because Sharp's and Redmond's name are actually there in the mosaic on the bottom right-hand corner, right by the entrance door to what is now Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique. Yes,
very, very out of the ordinary, because you had artists like Emile Coury, Sam McKim, all of this doing it. You know, Ken Anderson, Claude Coates, providing all of this beautiful artwork. And again, it was all just Disney. Everything was, and you know, the people I've talked with over the years, they didn't feel any regret over that. Any, you know, grumble of, well, I should have, you know, people should know I did that and sign my name and all that, because, you know, a lot of things at Disney come through collaboration. You know, that is with animation, which is one of the great collaborative arts, you know. Even though you can sometimes pick out individual animators like a Ward Kimball or a Glenn Keane or whatever, even then they don't do everything of that character. You know, they have assistants, there are in-betweeners, there are cleanup artists, there's ink and paint. There's special effects animators who might do something in that scene. There's the layout artist and then the background artist. So they're part of a bigger whole. And those people, Imagineers who worked on Disneyland and then later Walt Disney World, that was that same philosophy of, I'm going to contribute this, but I know that there are others who are going to be adding to that, and so after Walt's death, you see more of a dichotomy because Walt would help blend those different artistic visions together. After Walt's death, you get something like the Haunted Mansion where, the beginning of the attraction is very much, Claude Coates and Rolly Crump and very much a scary theme. And then as you go through the last half of the attraction, you're getting more and more Mark Davis, and Mark Davis, known for his humorous take of all of these things. I don't think people realize when they're going through the Haunted Mansion and they're going through the graveyard that the last figure that you see before you exit to the hitchhiking ghost is a female opera singer. Mm-hmm. Because it's not over until the fat girl sings. Right. That's why the female opera singer is, a female opera singer in the graveyard. Okay, I guess so. But that's why it's there. And so, that's the Mark Davis type of. I guess that's another secret of Disneyland.
See, we sneak in little secrets among some of the bigger secrets.
So, do you have another secret for us?
I do, and it's going to take us to one of my favorite lands in any of the Disney parks, World and Land, and you would think it's Foodland or Cozy Cone Land, and it's not. Main Street USA, Jim, is one of my favorite lands on both parks. I spend sometimes a lot of time there just wandering and exploring, and there's easily 10, 100
we were
secrets.
Even talking before the broadcast about you visited recently, and the moment you set foot on Town Square there in Main Street, an entirely different feeling overwhelmed you.
Absolutely, yeah, and it still does. And when I was researching my very first audio tour, which was Main Street USA, I was fascinated at how much I had learned about the Walt Disney World version. And now when I go to Disneyland, I spent a lot of time there recently just doing nothing but exploring every little nook and cranny, every little detail, and we could easily do a top 10, top 20, top 100 things.
We could easily do an entire show just on Main Street USA.
And maybe we'll have to sort of come full circle and do that. But one of the things that fascinates me about Main Street USA on both parks is their genesis, the evolution of what they looked like in 1955, 1971 versus what they look like today. Because many of the storefront facades actually were home to individual shops, both in World and in Land. And so to give you an example of some of the things that were in Disneyland in 1955, there was Bank of America, there was a tobacco shop, there was Ellen's gift shop, the Gallon Camp, which was a shoe company, Gibson's greeting cards, a glass blower, Grandma's baby shop. Not that you don't go buy babies in there. I think it was probably closed for babies. There was the Gem Rock shop. Let's see. There was also.
Did you cover Wurlitzer? And
I have. I'm sort of going somewhat alphabetical.
A ham at the Market House.
There was a pen shop.
Ham at the Market House. Imagine carrying that around Disneyland.
Because what else do you want to bring Mom when you come home from Disneyland but a giant ham? The Polaroid Camera Center.
Or a giant Wurlitzer. Yeah, I went to Disneyland. I brought home this Wurlitzer.
But I love that, right? Because I love the fact that you could bring home china and glass, jams and jellies. There was the Town Square Realty. There was the Upjohn Pharmacy shop, the watch shop. Like you said, the Wurlitzer, the Yale and Town Lock Shop, and of course, the Intimate Apparel. The what? The Intimate Apparel Shop. The Wizard of Bras, which presented by the Hollywood Maxell Bra Company of Los Angeles. You could, because this is what you...
That guy, the reason he had that shop there was he was a good friend of C.V. Wood. who was the first president of Disneyland, and so CV gave him a bargain rate, and I think the guy gave CV a kickback, which is one of the reasons CV Wood.
I was going to say, CV Wood has his own story. Yeah, maybe
and so that's why it was there, and that's why that shop had that little front porch, that raised front porch, so that the kids couldn't easily, look into the shop, and also the front porch was there so that men who didn't want to go in with their spouses or whatever to browse around intimate apparel could just stay out there on that front porch waiting.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite places when I can get a chance to sit up there, just to sit and watch the people go by. But it really had sort of two rooms to it. There was the Victorian themed sort of front room, and there was an old Singer sewing machine from, I think, the mid 1800s. If you are an old time Disneylander, you may not remember it because it only lasted about 6 months or so before it closed. Obviously, I never saw it. I don't know if you ever had a chance to see it when you were there. I mean, I've read a little about what was there.
Again, it was before my time when it was intimate apparel, but like you, I've had a chance to go over there and stand on the porch, and then when it was converted into some other shop or something, I believe I was able to walk up the steps and on the porch and get in there. I think that may be closed off there now.
Yeah.
To get inside the building or not. Right across the street from that, though, is the mezuzah. Basically, what happened in 1995 is former Disneyland president Paul Pressler goes, at Walt Disney World, they celebrate Hanukkah. They have that whole, display at the American Adventure. Here at Disneyland, when we get to the holidays, it's all Christmas. It's all Christmas decorations. There's nothing there, to promote Hanukkah. And so in 1995, what he did is on the other side of the street from Intimate Apparel there, New Century Jewelry, which used to be the Upjohn Pharmacy, where you could get a free little bottle of vitamins. And if you went to the Yale Lock Shop, you got a free little Disneyland key. And Upjohn also had free postcards. All right. Anyway, right across there at before the entrance to New Century Jewelry, there's a door, and again, we've got these businesses, and we're all so familiar about, the upper windows are real names of people who worked on Disneyland, and, sometimes they're sort of gag references or whatever. Anyway, on the door, right before Upjohn, is the name Dr. Benjamin Stein. And Dr. Benjamin Stein is not a real person and was not involved, to the best of my knowledge, not a real person. I did research. I couldn't find any connection with him and Disneyland. Maybe one of the listeners will leave a comment and say, "Oh yes, he was Paul Pressler's, doctor to do this." But I couldn't find anything about that. And the door says, "Have a fever, have the flu, come on in, and we'll cure you." But right to the side of the door is the mezuzah, which is a piece of parchment with verses from the Torah, and it's usually like in a little metal case or whatever, and it's there on the doorway, following the biblical command, to inscribe the words of this Jewish prayer, on the way into your home. And then one of the reasons that was done was so that during the holiday season, if you look up to the second floor, you'll see Hanukkah decorations. You'll see a menorah in the window. And again, something that only exists for that brief period of time. And that is not, by the way, if you go look and find that mezuzah now. That's not the original one. The original one was literally stolen in 2004. There are Disneylanders who love Disneyland so much that they would steal the apple in the in the Snow White ride, right? So now it's that hologram type thing, projection. So that was stolen, but then it got replaced. And so, but again, how often are people looking at the doorways, looking at the facades on Main Street? Mostly it's like, I've got to run, so that I can get onto Space Mountain. I can get onto, Splash Mountain. I can,
But that's why we like.
Tour.
But that's part of the purpose of talking about things on Main Street, so they understand as they walk by why that was there, why that raised porch is there, what was behind that door. Because the interesting thing too about the Intimate Apparel shop was it was not only a shop, and look, I've talked about certain things being my holy grails of collectibles. If anybody has a bra from the Disneyland Intimate Apparel shop, I don't want to sound creepy, but I would almost be curious if it was somehow branded with Disneyland on the tag. But it was a store and a show too, right? That Wizard of Bras. I feel so uncomfortable saying it. Was on like a little.
Now I'm going to blame you because I have never in my life seen one of those, and yes, it does sound creepy, but I'd love to see one if it had like a Disneyland tag or something to that. But now you're encouraging. There's so many people selling fake stuff on eBay. People know that I'm also interested in comic books and comic strips, and I've written about those. And lately there's been a big flood of original art forgeries on the internet, especially since it's Jack Kirby's 100th birthday. And if you don't know Jack Kirby, it's quite appropriate for a Disney podcast because he's the guy who created most of those Marvel characters of Thor and the Fantastic Four and all of that in collaboration with Stan Lee. I see them both. I don't think either Lee or Kirby did work as good separately as they did when they did it together. But anyway, because it's his 100th birthday, there's a lot of forged original artwork out there. This is a sketch that Jack Kirby did. And a lot of Charles Schulz stuff is out there. Mm-hmm. And what is sad is people are selling this, and they're selling it with this certificate of authenticity. And I want to say, look, if you could forge that artwork, it doesn't occur to you that I could believe that you're forging a certificate of authenticity, especially since you're signing Schultz's name with a T.
Right.
Which is a very common error for that to happen. So now you're encouraging people to have fake Disneyland bras on eBay, rare vintage intimate apparel.
Okay.
But then again, I'm going to have people coming to me and go, "Is this?" And I'm going to have to say, now, is this the type of bra that was made in the 1950s? Is this the type of material?
All right, let me make it less creepy, because what I'd rather see more than the actual bra itself was, this was, like I said, this Wizard of Bras was this. It was a little show. It wasn't a person. It was like a host on a little revolving stage and had a taped.
Yes.
It had a taped message where and there was also a little optical illusion. So as you moved from looking at one side of the stage, you would see sort of the model's attire disappear, and you would see their undergarments, their corsets, and their pantaloons, as it were. So I would have loved to have seen, if anybody has pictures of that the Wizard of Bra exhibit. Again,
in those days, people didn't take pictures because you're limited to the number of photos you can take, unlike today. And then also, this is an interior thing. And again, a lot of cameras in those days were not good enough to take a precise picture inside. And then again, as you say, this is an illusion. There's a projection and all of this, and trying to take a picture of that, even with some of today's cameras, is challenging. And but again, people visiting Disneyland today, have you taken pictures of some of these things? Did you just assume they were always going to be there? Did you always assume there were going to be live mermaids in the lagoon? Did you always assume there was going to be a flying saucer ride? Did you always assume there was going to be the Welch's grape juice stand that in the back had a hand-painted mural of Fantasia by Ivan Earle, who was the art director for Sleeping Beauty? He actually, during the production of Sleeping Beauty, Walt sent him down to the park, and he painted, this mural on the back of this juice stand. Did you assume that was all going to be there? Disney is constantly changing. It's constantly in flux, and one of the things that really impresses me about Disneyland, and the last time I was physically there was about a year and a half ago, and was how much they're able to pack in to such a small amount of space, and yet it doesn't intrude on other things in there. And Lou, if people are really excited about these secrets, they need to realize that Jim Korkis has
Where can they go for more? Where can they go for more of these secrets?
Jim Korkis has just released a book called Secret Stories of Disneyland, Trivia Notes, Quotes, and Anecdotes, which you can get at Amazon.com. And I never thought I would write a Disneyland trivia fun fact book, because everybody has, and I know that there's more coming. But my publisher sort of challenged me, and he said, well, but nobody could write a book the way you could. Nobody knows the stories that you know. Can you come up with some different stories, some of which I've shared today on this podcast, or can you come up with a different perspective on a familiar story? And so I took that as a challenge, figuring I'm never going to be able to do this, but this is sort of a fun exercise. And before I knew it, I had a book with almost 100 two-page little secret stories, and fortunately, people seem to be enjoying it, and you might as well. Secret Stories of Disneyland, Trivia Notes, Quotes, and Anecdotes. I also write the Secret Stories of Walt Disney World series, but I take that one a little bit more seriously, because nobody is writing about Walt Disney World. So it's important to get that information out there and document it. But Disneyland, everybody's writing about it. So I include stories like the Main Street, since we're on Main Street, the Main Street train station clock tower. The clock itself was one of the final things put in there, because that hole, that space there, is where they put a camera so that they could film Disneyland being built. So remember all those wonderful speeded up versions you saw of the shops being built on Main Street? The camera was right up there in the clock tower on top of the train station. Well, when Disneyland opened, one of the biggest complaints they were continually getting was the time is wrong on the clock. And so each day they'd get that complaint, and poor little maintenance guy would have to come out with his ladder, and he'd have to climb up to the clock and reset the clock. And sure enough, later in the day, complaints still kept coming back in. And so the concern was, well, what's wrong with the clock? Is it the heat? Is that affecting the gears? Things can expand, contract, things like that. Is it sabotage? There were some workers who were really upset, having to work so long on getting Disneyland open on time. And so, in fact, on opening day, they snipped the wires to the Flight to the Moon attraction, so it wouldn't work. So, oh my gosh, is this sabotage of that going on? Is there something wrong with the gears? Did they just not buy the the top quality, whatever. So they tracked, every movement, and they talked to the maintenance guy, and he says, well, I come to the bottom here. He says, I phone City Hall, Town Hall in Town Square there to, get the correct time. I set my watch. I climb up, the ladder. I reset the clock exactly. And they watched, and yep, that's exactly what he was doing. And so they kept following every moment. Finally, they stationed somebody in City Hall. Let's check on the time when the phone call comes in or whatever. And so the phone call comes in, and the secretary picks up the phone, and she looks out her window at the time on the clock and tells the guy the time, and then hangs up. And that story and almost 90 more are in Secret Stories of Disneyland. And but you heard a couple of stories today, too, that aren't in the book. So if the book is successful, I've got a couple more stories for a second volume for that to happen.
Well, how about this? If this show is successful, if you, the listener, like this show, I still have more. Jim has more. Why don't we do a part 2, 10 more secrets and stories that you never knew about Disneyland?
You have got to, send in your comment. You have got to vote. You have got to let Lou know, because Lou and I can sit and talk about anything. We could talk about bugs on Main Street.
I know that I have 5 more still on my list. I know you have hundreds more on your list, in and out of your book. So let us know.
And again, how often do you talk about Disneyland on this show?
And sometimes I say not often enough. And look, I've done a number of shows going back almost to the beginning where, why every Walt Disney World fan needs to visit Disneyland. I did a family guide to Disney. I've done a number of shows. I'll link to them in the show notes, because I've really fallen in love with this park. I go once or twice a year. And even if you consider yourself a Walt Disney World fan, I think that you do need to go and explore and enjoy all of the secrets and the stories and the culinary arts that Disneyland has to offer.
The park where Walt walked.
Listen, little Jimmy Korkis, I love you, brother. I love what you do. I appreciate you in so many ways. I love having you be part of the show. I will link to where they can find not just the Secret Stories of Disneyland trivia notes, quotes, and anecdotes book, but your other 14 or 13 books. And if you, the listener who's sitting around this virtual table with us, have a secret or a favorite Disneyland secret or story, share yours in the comments on Facebook. Call the voicemail at 407-900-9391. And Jim, my friend, we will definitely do this again soon.
Okay. Take care, Lou. Thank you so much.
Thank you, buddy.